Well, thank you for allowing me to give this talk. I have to admit that old coins have always appealed to me. One of the very first coins I ever purchased around age 10 or 12 was a 1794 English halfpenny token with Lady Godiva on it. And I remember getting off the escalator on the third or fourth floor of a Robinson's department store in downtown Los Angeles, turning right and going directly to the store's coin and stamp department. There it was in a glass display case. Now, mind you, this is 50 years ago. They don't have coin departments in most department stores anymore. Anyhow, you sure couldn't afford a American coin from 1794 under 10 bucks like I could for this. So that was my first introduction to Condor tokens. So most of you know what Condor tokens are. They're tokens produced in the 1790s when there was a shortage of mint-issued small change. The term originates from James Condor, who wrote the first catalog of these tokens. You can get an original copy of his book on occasion. This picture was from Abe's Books. So it was available for about 400 bucks recently, $400 just a couple weeks ago. So I don't own one yet for my library, but probably will at some point. Probably the most important reference, though, is Dalton and Hammer's book, which was first printed in 1910. This is a copy of my 1967 reprint of that. And all the D&H numbers listed in this talk are going to be based on this catalog. There are over 10,000 varieties of tokens in this catalog, too. So it's pretty comprehensive. So I've purchased a number of these tokens over the years, but I really got hooked on them when I saw this particular one with a snail on it at an auction catalog. Who could resist? Even though it had traces of this kind of green snail slime on it, the country scene with the tree, the bridge, the snail was very appealing. And the motto is really intriguing. A snail may put his horns out. It gets even better, though, because on the obverse, it was an advertising token for a coin dealer, Thomas Spence. So a few of my Condor tokens were made by Spence, but those are mainly political, and I didn't quite get the connection with a snail. So I had to figure out what it meant. And this is where I jumped down a rabbit hole or two in search for an answer. And I even wrote a paper for the PCNS about this. Came in second. Michael Wehner's paper appropriately came in first. It was a good paper. Anyhow, since this is an English token, it made sense to look at English literature. And it turns out there are a number of nursery rhymes about snails. And here are three of them. And it turns out that there are rhymes about snails all over Europe, Russia, and China. Apparently, children played games collecting and torturing these little critters while repeating the rhymes. Coaxing a snail to put out its horns was considered a good omen for health, for the weather, and for the harvest. This just didn't seem typical of Thomas Spence, though. And I looked really long and hard to see if I could find a French ditty about broiling them in garlic butter and eating them, but I just couldn't find one. So it seemed a little bit more relevant is the image. And I found some photographs that were found in the margins of English, French, and Flemish illuminated manuscripts from the 13th century. And I have to say, these images all came from the British Library. I did get permission from the British Library to use images from their internet, so they're tiny little thumbnail images. This is as clear as I can get. But these were little drawings kind of in the margins of these beautiful, beautiful illuminated manuscripts from the medieval times. And they're of knights fighting snails. And it's usually the snails had the upper hand or the upper horn. And nobody knows quite for sure what the scenes meant, but one theory was a reference to the Lombards. The Lombards originated in Scandinavia and migrated south, eventually ruling much of Italy. They were known for their ferocity in battle until encountering Charlemagne in 772, where they panicked and ran. In the 13th century, they became known as pawnbrokers and usurers. Usurers are lenders of money at exorbitant rates. They were very unpopular and viewed as cowards, people who might flee the lowly snail. So I was wondering, could Thomas Spence have been exhorting the snail perhaps to fight usury? And this is the one place where I thought maybe I could tie this to San Francisco, because we have a Lombard Street here in San Francisco. Unfortunately, the name Lombard has no link to San Francisco. San Francisco surveyor Jasper O'Farrell named the road after Lombard Street in Philadelphia. The street in Philadelphia, which began as an alley in 1740, was named after Lombard Street in London. That Lombard Street was named after the Lombard moneylenders who occupied the street during the Renaissance. I finally gave up searching random internet sites, and I asked Alan Davison, who has a internet site that auctions actually frequently Condor tokens. And he turned me on to this particular book by Arthur Waters. This is actually a reprint that's easily available online now. This is from 1906, and it pulled information from the 18th century tokens from then contemporary literature regarding the snail. Quote, "This curious design implied the snail can do as it likes, but the Englishman, under the powers that were, and at the end of the 18th century, could do nothing without coming within the clutches of law and tyranny of the private owners of land." Basically, this was another of Spence's hints at landlordism. So there was a bit of a political aspect to this token, which led me to trying to determine, well, who was Thomas Spence? What led him to his political views and the tokens, which I will show you in a little bit. Spence's parents migrated from Scotland to Newcastle, where Thomas was born in June 21 of 1750. His father, a poor hardware dealer, had 19 children. His mother, Margaret, was his father's second wife. Thomas was only about 5 feet tall. He had a limp and a speech impediment, and he was described variously as simple, sincere, single-minded, serious, odd, and querulous. He was married to Miss Christian Elliot in 1777, and his son William was born 4 years later, but it was an unhappy marriage, and he eventually moved away in 1787. His wife died reportedly of cancer sometime between 1787 and 1791. He was remarried in 1791 to a good-looking servant girl to whom he proposed at first sight when he saw her cleaning the steps of a house, and she accepted immediately. And the literature up until recently said they got married on the same day, but recent information actually found her name, which was Anne Lamboll, and the marriage was by banns, spelled B-A-N-N-S, where an announcement has to be made once a week for 3 weeks before the wedding can occur. She eventually deserted him, and rumor was it that she agreed to marry him in the first place because she was angry at her boyfriend at the time. His son died in 1797, and he died unexpectedly in 1814. He had little formal schooling, but he was taught to read the Bible as a child while standing beside his father at a hardware store on the Sandgate near the river in Newcastle. He was taught his father's trade of making nets, and then he worked as a clerk for Mr. Headley, a respectable smith. He worked as a teacher at the Free Grammar School and then as a teacher at the Sandgate Chapel School. He developed a new phonetic alphabet for pronunciation, which he called Spenconian. This was to help the illiterate learn to read and write and pronounce words correctly, hoping to disguise class distinctions. In other words, people were discriminated against because of their bad accents or whatever, and this was trying to equalize the playing field. He later published several of his papers in the script. It never took hold, but modern linguists have noticed it would have been a very good system. Spence related that his father, who was a member of the Glassite Church, made his sons read the Bible and questioned them about what they had read at the end of every chapter. The habit of reflecting on what he read and reasoning about happenings was formed early. The Reverend James Murray was the most important friend of Spence's youth. Murray taught Spence to see the stark contrast between biblical promise and harsh social reality. Spence's poverty during both his childhood and adult life taught him to sympathize with the industrious poor and to condemn the idle rich. In 1771, there was an attempt to enclose part of Newcastle town moor, which had previously existed as an open common parkland. An indignant local population decided to fight the decision of the Common Council, and in 1773, the action of the council was overturned. This uprising was never forgotten by Spence and likely led to a lecture he gave 2 years later at the Newcastle Philosophical Society. This lecture that he gave was entitled Property in Land, Everyone's Right. Several of the reprints later were called The Rights of Man, which actually precedes Thomas Paine's book, The Rights of Man, which was printed in 1791. Shortly after giving the lecture, Spence published it and sold it on the streets. For presenting this lecture and for immediately publishing it and hawking it about like a halfpenny ballad, the Philosophical Society did him the honor of expelling him. But his lecture proposed a plan which he focused on for the rest of his life. It included the end of aristocracy, the elimination of landlords, arguing that all land should be owned by parishes or towns and ridden from the parish by its inhabitants. It proposed universal suffrage, including women's suffrage, a social guarantee extended to provide income for those unable to work, and the rights of infants to be free from abuse and poverty. And to help publicize his ideas at the time, he used a series of punches prepared by his friend Thomas Bewick to counterstamp slogans on circulating coins. These aren't mine, these are from the internet, but these are a number of counterstamped coins. The punches he used have been well documented. There are 27 different known ones. He continued to use them at least through 1797, and he even put them on one of his own tokens, which I will actually show you in a couple minutes. Well, Newcastle and most of England wasn't ready for his kind of thinking, and his unpopular views allegedly led to a decline in enrollment at his school where he taught. He was fired, and along with his unhappy marriage, he perhaps was prompted to move to London in 1787 or 1788. And there's about a 4-year gap that I'm not sure what happened, but starting in 1792, he opened a stall in Chancery Lane as a book and salop seller. Salop is a hot beverage flavored with sassafras. He began publishing political broadsides and selling radical pamphlets, which occasionally led to commotion around the stall between supporters and detractors. And actually, some of his detractors sent thugs around to his business to try to detract his supporters. Late that year, he's arrested for the first time, but not the last time, for seditious libel. Shortly after his release on Christmas Eve, his landlord gave him 3 months' notice to quit the stall. He was soon arrested again and released again, and in March 1793, he moved his business to a shop on Little Turnstile, is the name of the street. Number 8 Little Turnstile, High Holborn Street, which is a short walk from where the British Museum was and still is. And since this is where the rest of the talk centers on, I thought I'd give you a little bit of a geography lesson if you're as disinclined with geography as I am. Here's Newcastle upon Tyne, here's London, and Spence moved to this area on Little Turnstile Street. There is a new turnstile and there's a great turnstile nearby. This little yellow square here is the British Museum. You can see there's Buckingham Palace, there's the Tower of London. So he was right in the center of things. And this is Little Turnstile Street of today. It's right off of the High Holborn underground exit. You go up a couple steps. You start at this. You can see at the end of this awning, that's how big Little Turnstile Street is. You go, and this tavern was formed in 1549, and it actually sounds like it's got really good food and good beer selection. So next time I'm in London, I'm gonna have to go visit this place. Halfway down the street, you can see the rest of Little Turnstile, but there's a door in the middle for numbers 7 to 8 Little Turnstile. It wasn't a storefront. Actually, down a hallway in the back is where his shop was. So anyhow, he called his shop the Hive of Liberty, and from it, it became a prominent radical bookseller and a writer. Undaunted by the arrests, he started a penny periodical called Pig's Meat, or Lessons for the Swinish Multitude, a reference to the working class who had been dubbed the Swinish Multitude by conservative politician Edmund Burke. He continued to back women's suffrage, wrote on the rights of infants, and held radical meetings in his shop. And he spent a lot of time in the 1790s and early 1800s in and out of court. The 1793 report on sedition in London described him this way: "He lives in the dirtiest poverty, but his shop is decorated with lines of prose and verse expressing determination to carry on this traffic of political pamphleteering in spite of the laws of magistracy." In 1794, the English crown, concerned about French and American revolutions, suspended habeas corpus. This time, Spence was jailed and held without trial for 7 months. He even commemorated it with this halfpenny token, the 7 months imprisoned. He was born in poverty. He struggled through life. He died in poverty. He actually became one of the leading revolutionaries of the late 18th century and early 19th century. Even his son was jailed for selling his work. But it was at this shop in Little Turnstile that he launched a new craze for collecting, he latched onto a new craze for collecting privately issued tokens. These tokens, known as contra tokens, were issued by merchants because of the chronic shortage of small change. He now became a coin dealer and began minting political tokens and tokens advertising his shop. This is kind of a play on word, the Little Turnstile halfpenny for Little Turnstile as the address. It's got an old screw press, and this one has a really great die break on it. So it's one of my favorite tokens. He made his tokens mostly from 1794 to 1796. There is no evidence that he actually owned a coining press, but the tokens were manufactured in the quantities ordered by Spence. Dies were produced for him. They were used under his control on blanks obtained by him, and they were sold by him. So producing a large variety of tokens gave him an added outlet to express his radical political ideas. He was even known to fling them from the windowsill at passersby. It seems very likely that the planchets were from different sources, because I have some half-penny planchets that are 20 to 30 millimeters. Some are thick enough to allow for edge lettering and some aren't. So I was not able to find where he was able to obtain the planchets from. He did publish a handbill listing 20 obverse and 20 reverse dies that could be ordered paired in any combination you order. A correspondent for the periodical called Gentleman's Magazine wrote of seeing many thousands of tokens lying in heaps and selling at very great prices in his shop. Spence was fortunate to have the talents of Charles James as a die engraver. Spence had the ideas, the bitterness, the satirical imagination, but it was the vivid imagery of James that made these pieces stand out and led to the popularity that remains today. One author described the designs as miniature political poems. Let me see, there were over 1,000 types of contra tokens produced around London and thousands more throughout Britain. One of the most prolific issuers was Gilbert Pidcock, who owned a menagerie located on a major London thoroughfare, and he minted tokens with a wide variety of animals, real and imagined. Peter Kempson in Birmingham and John Skidmore nearby in London were also prolific, producing tokens. They often portrayed form as buildings. Politics was common as well. It's likely that the workshop that minted Spence tokens also minted tokens for others, as some of the planchets with edge lettering meant for Spence have been found on these other tokens. Spence went bankrupt in late 1796, likely from the expense of large-scale token production and the costs of his imprisonment. He sold his dies to John Skidmore, who had a shop nearby. And Skidmore continued the practice of combining dies at random, like Spence often did. Sometimes he would join Spence's dies, engraved by Charles James, with Skidmore's dies, who were engraved by an engraver named Jacobs. Spence moved to 9 Oxford Street in 1797, the year his son died. Government repression eventually stopped all ways for radicals to organize publicly, so they started resorting to chalking walls and popping into pubs to sing subversive songs and continuing to countermark circulating coins. Spence continued selling his propaganda from a closed barrow, which he pushed around the streets of London. At his funeral in 1814, many political admirers attended, and his tokens were given away at the funeral procession. So In 1969, the British Numismatic Society published an article by R.H. Thompson. It's available online, called The Dies of Thomas Spence. It lists all his known and suspected die attributions and combinations, 3 variations of edge lettering, and the 27 different counter stamps. I had to tape 5 different pages together to make a table to look up all these coins. I took a picture with my dog in front of it just to give you an idea, because it's a little difficult when you're trying to pinpoint dies that match to different obverses and reverses. And there are a couple of varieties of tokens that are listed as made by Spence that probably weren't made by him, and I'll show you those. So I'm going to go over some of my Spence tokens and explanations of what I found to be the meaning of his mottos. This is the first one that's listed in Dalton and Hammer, and it's felt to be the first token made by Spence. And it describes Spence's glorious plan. It lists the November 8th, 1775 date of the famous speech he gave. On the reverse, it shows a cornucopia, olive branch, and scales of justice. But this is also the one type of token that Spence countermarked. The land is ours, and land in partnership. So these are pretty rare. I've only been able to find actually 2 in the literature, and this is the 3rd one that I got at auction. So his own tokens weren't usually counterstamped. It was usually common change that was. Next obverse in Dalton and Hammer's book are the ones that have this image of him complaining about being imprisoned. I love the reverse 4, but he would made this obverse to a number of different reverses, which sometimes didn't make sense. The gallant garb of a Scotland. Not quite sure what that meant, but this is one of the tokens reverses to this particular die. These 2 may actually explain that gallant garb a little bit better. Thomas had a brother who lived in Newcastle, and he issued a dozen different tokens advertising his brother Jeremiah J. Spence, slop seller in Newcastle. They all have the same obverse. There are a dozen different reverses. They all have the obverse featuring a keelman in his best clothes, which would have been a flat hat, a blue coat, a yellow waistcoat, slate gray trousers, and buckled shoes. I was fortunate to find a contemporary engraving from that time to show the colors. Slop, in case you were wondering, is an Old English term for cheap, ready-made, and often loose-fitting clothing, especially sailors' trousers. Since his brother's business was on the quayside in Newcastle, he most likely sold seamen's clothing. This noted advocates for the rights of man include Sir Thomas More, who was a noted Renaissance humanist, Thomas Paine, who advocated for the revolutionary causes in America, and not being a shy one, Spence listed his name first among the 3 Thomases. This other reverse after the revolution is how Spence envisioned the freedom after the revolution if his plan was followed. Another token with clothing is a bridewell boy. And this took a little research to figure out what it is. In 1553, Nicholas Ridley, the Bishop of London, convinced young King Edward to grant his palace at Bridewell as a place of punishment for disorderly women and as a charitable institution or school for training and education of poor children. The contemporary word at the time for a charitable institution was hospital. So Bridewell Prison and Hospital was also governed jointly with Bethlehem Hospital for the Insane, which was better known as Bedlam. So Bridewell became a very infamous prison, and the school that was associated with it understandably changed its name and moved to Whitley in the 1800s, and it continues to this day. Tuition is about £20,000 a year for room and board. Bridewell boys at the time wore a blue uniform and white hats. They at one time used to fight fires, but that custom stopped in 1790 because of friction with the insurance officer's own firemen. This next one shows how Spence saw things before his revolution. This shows an emaciated man sitting in prison with his ribs showing and he's gnawing on a bone. This design was suggested from a description of the Bastille the morning after its capture. Rouse, Britannia was described by Spence as Britannia confounded and the cap of liberty falling to the ground. It's been explained that it was Spence's wish for an apathetic British public to wake up. The Britannia doesn't look particularly sleepy here. Here are a couple aspects of the threat of liberty. This obverse depicts a sailor on the right seizing a landsman, which was referred to the Royal Navy's system of supplying men by the feared press gang. Men would literally be taken off of commercial vessels or off of the street and forced onto naval ships to serve as sailors at the time. The reverse features a North American Indian holding an axe and a bow. And in one of Thomas Spence's pig's meat issues, he holds this conversation with an Indian. Many colonies of Christians have established themselves in various parts of America and carry on here, as in their original country, at the iniquitous traffic in the soil. They expel or exterminate us, the natives, because we will not work or pay rent to them for living in our own country. We freeborn Indians cannot submit to pay homage or rent to any man for leave to dwell upon the earth, though he would say God would have it so. Speaking of pig meat, there were 3 Spence dies featuring the publication. The publication came out in 72 different parts in 3 volumes between 1793 and 1794. It had extracts of radical writings from various authors, including Spence himself. Some included this copper plate engraving, similar to the engravings you'll see on the coins. This is that matchless pig's meat, so famous far and near. Oppressor's heart it fills with dread, but poor man's heart does cheer. So here's the first of my 3 Spence tokens with the pig's meat. It's got a talking pig, pig's meat published by Thomas Spence, trampling on the regalia of the crown and a liberty cap on top. And you've got the 3 Thomases, or the 3 advocates on the reverse of this one. This one actually has the volume of pig meats on the right. Let's see, 27. And the reverse, the obverse image of a cat with the motto, "In society, live free like me." Spence would designate the cat as his coat of arms because it could be stroked down, but would not suffer itself to be rubbed against. And one thing I love about this is it's got a really neat die clash. You can really read the lettering right. When I purchased this at auction in London, they call this shadowing. Took me a while to figure out what they meant in the catalog description there. So this is a farthing with more pig's meat, a pig trampling the emblems of royalty, and another liberty cap on the other side. Obverse, it depicts Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden with a somewhat complex meeting. In one sense, it could represent the innocence of earthly paradise, but Adam and Eve also recall the fall of man and Milton's words, which are here in the legend, affirming that the desirable state is social equality. This one, Middlesex, Dalton and Hammer, number 814, is a little bit of a heavy-hitting political token. The obverse features Cain standing over a slain Abel. Spence felt that this was the start of oppression in the human race. He said that Abel seemed to resemble the commonality, Cain the nobility. Cain is a symbol for land seizures and hence suppression of the landless. The reverse end of oppression features 2 men dancing around a bonfire of land charters or title deeds, freeing them from the oppression of the landlords. Same die is used for the obverse of this, but the reverse shows a caduceus on its side. With, I gotta make sure I got this right. Yeah, the caduceus is a symbol of commerce. There's a crown at the top, a liberty cap at the bottom. So if you turn the caduceus upright the way it was, the crown is on top. Turn things around with Spence's plan, and the Liberty Cap is on top. Here's another one with the same caduceus on the reverse. This features the Tree of Liberty on the obverse. 4 men are dancing around a pole. Instead of a traditional Liberty Cap on the pole, Spence took the liberty of removing the head of William Pitt the Younger, who was the prime minister at the time, and placing it on the pole. Spence said it was the head of the protector of men's liberties, but I'm not sure if he's being facetious or not. Speaking of heads, Spence joined 2 of them here. William Pitt the Younger is here on the left in tears. Charles Fox is on the right laughing. Fox is the leader of the opposition, and he's very gleeful because Pitt is unhappy with his unpopularity and his inability to control sedition and revolt. The inscription Quis rides means, who are you laughing at? Prime Minister Pitt increased taxes to pay for war against France and cracked down on radicalism. Fox supported American patriots, the French Revolution, and he felt King George was a tyrant. He was also an abolitionist and supported religious minorities and was somebody that Spence admired. On the other hand, the Janiform head could also equate the two in the attitude of whatever your parties ye may call, you're all alike, so damn you all, which is another quote from Pig's Meat. We're not sure what the meaning of the heart on the hand was, although it could be from a line in a song that Spence published. The line goes, then let us all join heart in hand to haste this golden age's reign. Here's another 2-headed image. The head here is of King George III conjoined with the head of an ass. It gives you a sense of how Spence felt. The motto, a million hog, refers to the swinish multitude, as they've been called. The guinea pig is George III, as you can see from his image on a gold guinea. Speaking of asses, this is another one of my favorite here. This depicts the British public as a bull. This is actually a bull here with the head of an ass. Here you go. Being ridden by George III as the emblem of state oppression. Spence got the idea of this from this contemporary rhyme. John was once deemed John Bull, but now, alas, his spirit gone, he's mildly named Jackass. There are a couple kinds of tokens that have been attributed to Spence, but are only partly made by him. So these 2 are farthings, and they have familiar obverses, the 3 advocates, and here's Adam and Eve. But the reverse features an abolitionist image of a kneeling black slave in chains with clasped hands and the motto, am I not a man and a brother? This design was by Spence's friend Thomas Buick, who also produced his counterstamp punches. It was done for the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, founded in 1787 by Thomas Clarkson and Granville Sharp. The image first appeared on porcelain from the factory of Josiah Wedgwood, who was a noted abolitionist. In 1788, a consignment of these medallions was sent to Benjamin Franklin and spread among abolitionists and anti-slavery campaigners. It was worn in jewelry and hair ornaments and sent into snuff boxes. An interesting note about the image is that the upper classes typically didn't kneel to pray at the time these were minted. The image appealed to white European views of converting slaves to Christianity and ideas of humility. In the longer term, it highlighted ideals of racial inferiority. So the reverse die was used on 6 different farthing pieces, but there are a number of penny and half-penny tokens with the same image, but these were produced by other people. The penny-sized tokens came in copper and white metal, like the one I have here. Brass, some were even gilt. I've seen one that actually was either enameled or painted. Some have tiny initials TW, suggesting the die maker was Thomas Wyon, who engraved medals at Birmingham in the 1790s with his brother Peter, before eventually becoming the chief engraver of seals at the Tower Mint in London. It's not certain who engraved the dies for the smaller denomination pieces, though some consider it to be the work of This man, William Lutwidge, was a well-known dice sinker who also dabbled in counterfeits. And there are a number of Lutwidge tokens. Here, another screw press, provincial coins and metal, dice sinker, and engraver. So there's one final token that's attributed to Spence, but definitely was not made by him. This is Dalton and Hammer number 831. It features a man hanging from a gibbet with a church in the background. The motto, "End of Pain," is a play of words suggesting the end of the influence of Thomas Paine. There are two main reverses for this. I have one here. The Jacobin Club was a society of friends of the Constitution, a group of pro-French Revolution political activists. The motto referred to Paine as the knave or the spokesman of the Jacobins. As with the card game bridge, to never get a trick is to never be successful. So they're saying that you should never be successful in any of this. There's another reverse that goes with this hanging man, and it shows an open book titled The Wrongs of Man, January 21, 1793. Well, Thomas Paine's book was The Rights of Man, but it was published in 1791. However, January 21, 1793 is when King Louis XVI of France was executed. So this implies that Paine's ideas led to the death of Louis XVI, and it would do the same for King of England if it were followed. Well, Thomas Spence clearly admired Thomas Paine and would not have issued a token with this sentiment. There's a similar token with three men hanging, the Three Thomases, which was also not made by Spence because he's one of the three Thomas. They all probably came from Peter Skidmore. And Peter Skidmore is the one who purchased all of Thomas Spence's dies when Spence went bankrupt, which is interesting. Spence did produce one hangman token, though. It has the end of Pitt, referring to the Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger. The letter I of Pitt is replaced by an I, better to protect Spence from charges of treason. This is the only token in this talk that actually I don't own yet. So there are some others that Spence produced. They're all fascinating and show a pretty interesting, somewhat radical thinker from the 1790s and early 1800s. I welcome any corrections, additions, questions. And that's all I have to say. So I'm going to go ahead and stop share here and see what you guys have to say.